Great.
Hey writers, I am Lee Jessup, career coach for emerging and professional screenwriters, as well as screenwriting professor for the David Lynch grad program for cinematic studies. Say that three times. I'm kicking off a new series of videos today, interviewing managers, and I was really fortunate to be able to ask my friend John Zaozirny to come in and be my test pilot for this thing. So, hi, John.
Hey.
Thank you so much for being here. For those of you guys who don't know John, go do your research because, oh my God, has he done a million things? Number one scripts on the blacklist, big writers, big stories, and he always has a lot to say, which is really why I appreciated him coming in today. So, John, we're recording this in May 2025. How's the industry doing?
I mean, we survived to 2025, right? So it should all be good from now. I mean, like, here's my thinking on the matter is that like last year was brutal. It was really particularly brutal. I think it was brutal because, prior to the strikes, I think things were at a decent click. There was kind of like I want to say I forget when the Netflix bubble kind of popped or the stock dropped in a significant way. I want to say it's like 2021, 2022.
2022, yeah.
And so we've all been kind of dealing with the ripple effects of that, particularly in features, I would say. Um, and so, things were like there were so many series on the air and then post-strike there weren't. And I'm not saying it's the fault of the strike, but I think if you look at it as a larger narrative, there's a ton of production. Wasn't that always the joke? They're like, they're making too many shows. And so someone somewhere heard everybody. And so you come back in and they're just not making the same number of shows. Also, the CW has gone away, and that alone was probably hundreds of writer jobs, and that predates the strike. And so just a confluence of forces. And so 2024 was a pretty brutal year because I think people were hoping that we would just bounce back like we were pre-strike, and that didn't happen. And so we come to 2025, and my feeling is that, compared to 2024, I think 2025 is going to increase by like, let's call it 10 to 15%, which, you'd be like, oh, good, it's growing. But like, I think compared to where people were coming pre-strike in 2023, 2022, it feels like catastrophic. And you've seen, I'm sure, the WGA numbers and things like that. And so to me, here in the space of May, it feels like things are getting a little bit better, but it's so incremental that it's hard to exactly qualify it from like last year necessarily, and it's just kind of going very slowly as opposed to some rapid ramp up. And so I'm kind of optimistic, but it's also, it's a tough time, and staffing in particular, TV in particular, is really, really hard. So it's a difficult time. I think a little less difficult than last year, but again, only moderately better is kind of the situation. But they're kind of like green shoots, if you will, I'm seeing everywhere, particularly in the feature market, where I do think specs have started to pick up a little bit, you know? So that's kind of where my head's at.
And you and your team, you've had some recent successes on the feature side, which is really exciting to see. You have their three other managers at Bellevue with you. Um,
Sure.
how is all of that? Are you guys starting to feel a little sense of hope going forward?
I think you're trying to calibrate what the market is now. And, I think my colleague Jeff had a nice success with a script called Renegotiate, which sold to Lionsgate and got a lot of interest from a lot of different places. That was really cool. I think it's interesting. I don't know if I think Renegotiate would have sold in any kind of marketplace, but I do think the marketplace overall it's different from where it was 5 years ago in the feature space. And to that end, what I mean to say is I think it's more character and actor bait oriented, because I think especially for the streamers, they're looking at like what does, Brad Pitt want to do? What does Julia Roberts want to do? That's why a movie like After the Hunt, which is a phenomenal script, a good buddy of mine, Alan Mandelbaum's producing it over in Imagine. It attracted Julia Roberts to star, it attracted Luca Guadagnino to direct, and it gets made for, I want to say, like the budget was like, this is all publicly reported information, I believe. I want to say it was like 60 or something like that. It was certainly a lot of money. And that's a movie that I think 10, 15 years ago would have been made for sub $20 million as a theatrical movie, because the subject matter is, academia and sexual assault and very twisty, complex, hard issues. It's a phenomenal movie and a phenomenal. Oh, I don't know if it's a phenomenal movie. I haven't seen it, but I read the script. It's fantastic. But I think streamers are like Julie Roberts, Luca Guadagnino, we want to be in this business, and so we'll make it for 60 because we see a path. Their metrics are different than a theatrical metric per se, you know? And so that's the kind of material that I don't think would be a bidding war situation, but became one essentially. And so you're kind of looking, you're like, okay, I think like would speed be a bidding war in this marketplace? Maybe, maybe not, you know. I think it would sell for sure because it's a great script with a big concept, but it's not an actor bait kind of movie. It makes movie stars. It's kind of like horror movies. Horror movies make movie stars, but they're not generally things that most movie stars rush to be in per se. I would also say I don't think horror movies need movie stars, in my opinion. But yes, you're kind of calibrating the market and being like, okay, what's working out there? And you know, it's not necessarily the massive commercial high concept things that 5, 10 years ago I would think were slam dunks per se. It has moved a little bit more towards, you know, what is going to get an A-list actor to want to star in this movie, more often than not, you know. So that's kind of where I'm at in my head, which doesn't mean big things can't sell, but I think they have to be, you know, I know that when I talked to Jeff about Renegotiate, the script he sold, they knew they had an amazing commercial concept, but they worked really, really hard on the central lead role because they knew that they were going to need to get a movie star, or at least it would have to feel movie star worthy for buyers to want to step up to it. So that's just kind of an interesting change and recent change, in my opinion.
Yeah, and listen, that work on Renegotiate, you certainly have a very rich character that has his own internal journey to go through. So obviously impactful. And I think that the note behind the note, the idea of not just writing an interesting story, but writing really re rich and deep characters is always a good one to listen to.
Absolutely.
Now, we're in May of 2025. You and I talked about this earlier. There have been a lot of changes in the writer space, right?
Mhm.
Coverfly went away, Screencraft went away, Nicholl is now
Mhm.
accepting submissions through the blacklist. Any thoughts you could share with us on all of it?
I don't personally, my opinion, I don't think it's maybe as catastrophic as people might think it is. Personally, start with, I will admit that was not someone who really paid a heck of a lot of attention to Coverfly, honestly. I know that some of my colleagues did kind of pay some attention, but they found it very unwieldy to navigate. You couldn't search from like recently uploaded, so you're kind of like it would end up seeing the same scripts over and over, and it became a hard time. And there's just so many lists and badges and things like that. It ended up being overwhelming. And in my opinion, I don't think it was a website that got a ton of traction in the industry, I would say. I think within the kind of the writer space, it's like, oh my God, this and that. But I think for an agent at a prominent agency, they weren't paying a ton of attention because almost it was information overwhelm, you know? What we're looking for, like, here's one, two, three great scripts. Not here's like 500 great scripts. You know, it's like when I get an email from the Blacklist website every week, it's like, here are the scripts our readers recommended. It's rarely like 20 scripts. It's usually more like sometimes it's only one or two, sometimes it's like five. Obviously, it depends on how many scripts get an 8 ranking that week, you know, but it's like it's a short enough number that I can look at the log lines and get my handle around it. So I never found Coverfly super helpful in that sense. I would also moving a little bit Screencraft. I mean, they were a decent contest, so I think I did reading for them if I recall correctly. I mean, I didn't do paid reading; I just did judging, unpaid judging. That way, I could also, find potential clients through it. So that's unfortunate, but there are other contests and things like that. The Nicholl, I don't really feel personally it's that big a deal in the sense that the Nicholl has always veered relatively uncommercial. Um, and, it's just one of those things where I can understand the sense of frustration for people because they felt like the Nicholl, oh, it's the Academy's place. But I think if you look at the last 10 years of people, it hasn't like then those people are now running huge commercial movies for Hollywood. The way that like my old boss, my old bosses, Andrew Marlowe and Terry Miller, both broke in and writing, wing the Nichols. They both won the same year, which is how I think they met. And Andrew went on to write Air Force One and create Castle, and Terry and him worked on, create the the reboot of the Equalizer together and things like that. I that was there weren't almost any other competitions out there at that point, and so there's a little bit of a vacuum which doesn't exist in the present moment. And so to me, the what's going on with the Nichols, I don't personally find it necessarily as tragic as I think other people do, because I think people cling to the idea of the Nicholls from like the 90s or something. And I don't think that the Nicholl, I mean, we've had Nichols winners at Bellevue, and that's been cool, but like I think getting on the blacklist, the annual blacklist, was a bigger deal than to like agencies and the rest of the town than winning the Nicholl. Because winning the Nicholl almost felt like, oh, it's very artsy, it's very small. It kind of feels like akin to Sundance, I would say. Which isn't to say Sundance isn't great, but like Sundance isn't the kind of thing that Warner Brothers is going to go running towards per se. They might look at a director through and they'll be like, oh, can we turn this into someone more commercial? Um, but anyhow, it's one of those things where if I'm being really honest, I think that the annual blacklist took a lot of the heat away from the Nichols, essentially, because the annual blacklist was voted on by people who were in the industry. And I'm sure people are like, well, people aren't breaking in and stuff like that, and that feels unfair. The thing with the Nichols is like I don't think other than Justin Piasecki, who really has really broken through as a commercial writer. To be fair, not necessarily with the script that he won the Nichols with per se, which I think has kind of moved around. And I did read that early on, and I wish I'd seen the talent that is clearly there now with it. Although I did recognize he's a very talented guy. Um, I just don't. I think other than him, I'm struggling to think of writers who've taken that Nicholl win and transitioned to a full-time commercial writing career. I might be wrong on that to some degree, but it's not a place that we really looked. And I think, like I said, think landing on the annual blacklist, that is something where people pay a little bit more attention to that because it means it's kind of I mean, this whole town, and you and I were talking about this before, runs on buzz. It runs on I was talking to my colleague and he was saying, when one person says, oh, you should see this movie, I'm like, cool. When like two or three or four or five people all are saying, wow, this movie's amazing, then you got to go see it. And that's the same thing with the screenplay. You look and like, wow, 50 people like the script. Well, that means something, and that has weight to it. You can debate the merits of the annual blacklist up and down, but I'm just telling you you can be upset about it, but I'm kind of telling you this is the game, as it were, and I'm not in the interest. I can't reinvent the game. All I can do is play the game as it is. So I look at those things, and I can understand why, from an outside perspective, they're like, oh, that's so tragic, or this kind of things. But I think the reality was it was almost like a false sense of like, oh, I'm on the Coverfly red list. I don't think anyone cared, honestly. And I mean, like some people maybe, but like it didn't have the resonance that I think you might think it did. And so on, same thing with the Nichols. Now I think the Nichols is going to have a much shorter, I don't know what the term would be, semi-finalist list or advancing towards, I don't know what the term would be. But like if I can see that list and it's less than 100 people, I'm going to be spending a lot more time looking at that list than the list of 700 people or the list of 1,500. If you're like, I'm a Nichols quarterfinalist, well, cool. So we're like 1,000 other people. Things only have weight by the sense of their limitedness. And so someone says, hey, I'm recommending this one script, great, I'm going to pay attention. If someone says I'm recommending 50 scripts, it doesn't feel as quite as one person, I mean, it doesn't feel quite as weighty necessarily. So anyway, sorry, you asked a simple question, but that is my long rambling answer.
That for the record, I think writers would love to hear and should hear because there's a lot of navigating and understanding what does it all mean, right?
Sure.
Beyond the grief or the sadness that anybody feels about a loss of an avenue that they thought
I think
was
it's the
that,
loss of an idea of something, and
yeah.
the practical reality is I don't think it was necessarily the avenue. It's like, oh, the academy, the academy, the academy. It's like cool, but like, where did people go after when people who got that goal that you wanted, which is winning the Nicholl, where did their careers go after there? And I don't think that they necessarily moved into. I think it probably opened up an avenue, and probably managers maybe paid attention at that point or something like that. But I don't think CA was like they might have had a CA assistant read all the winners, and if they liked someone, they would pass it along. But like it wasn't like they were recruiting the cream of the it wasn't an automatic golden ticket to success. I mean, and I think people so often think like by the way, the blacklist has that as well. I know that's no fault of Frank Leonard or the people on the annual blacklist. There's a lot of people. I mean, I had a client once and she's like, and we're like, oh, what are your career goals? She goes, I want to be in the blacklist. I was like, beyond that, and they were like, I just want to be in the blacklist. And people think like you land on the blacklist and suddenly they're like, hello, sir or madam. Now here is your lifetime supply of Hollywood money. No, every year there's another blacklist and there's another batch of people. And, I would also say having had multiple number ones in the script and even number ones, it's like what that does is it boosts your profile, but what you do with that afterwards is really up to you. I would think of it, and I'm not a super sports aficionado, so my metaphor might be tortured, but like a draft, like an NBA draft, an NHL draft, NFL draft, whatever, is like you can be drafted really high and then nothing comes of it necessarily because you can't deliver at that next level. And I think what being on the blacklist, for example, does is it puts you into the next part of the game, but then where you go from there. Like I had a client who was in the blacklist, and we couldn't figure out his next script. We just never figured it out. And I think he stopped writing. He certainly stopped returning my phone calls and emails like within less than a year of being on the blacklist. And because I think he kind of maybe I'm now hypothesizing that he thought that the blacklist would result in, again, a lifetime supply of Hollywood jobs, and it doesn't. All it does is it maybe puts you in the mix for things, but it's kind of up to you to grab it and move on to the next level because it's a job. It's as competitive a job as honestly being in the NFL. And it's like, do you have the skill set to get to the next level? I think, Lee, I don't know, we could kind of get into this, but like one of the things that I think people are like, I'm a good writer, therefore I'm going to make a living as a screenwriter for the rest of my days. This isn't being a novelist, you know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? The screenplay is merely the starting point for a movie and for a career. It is all about collaboration. And so while being a great writer is important and talent is important, and that's essentially square one. If you don't have that, you got nothing. But you start with that, and then you're like, okay, cool. How are you in the room? How are you in collaboration? How are you coming up with commercial ideas that people are interested in? How driven are you? Are you like when something comes in for one of my clients, like, hey, they're doing a remake of this old TV show or whatever, and like, here are your ideas. And they're like, well, how about this idea? And they meet with the producers, and the producer's like, yeah, no, we don't like that idea. Well, you got to come up with a new one. You can't just be like, well, game over. And if you can't, honestly, sometimes on the spot, improvise and come up with new things, they're going to move on to someone who can. And so collaborative ability, attitude, drive, really being quote unquote good in the room, that's as meaningful as anything. Maybe more meaningful, right? Like I probably would, I'm sure people here to hate this, I would probably take a B plus writer who's great in the room or over an A minus writer who is terrible in the room. If you're A plus, if you're Charlie Kaufman, if you're one of the most phenomenal writers who's ever lived, okay, you can transcend that. But it's still going to be, you're still going to have some limitations on you because at certain point they're going to replace you with someone that they can get in their room with, and the director can be like, yeah, I don't know, maybe we change the third act instead of being like, nope, that doesn't work. They're gonna be like, okay, cool, I'll try to make that work because that's the job, you
Yeah.
know? And so I think people think, oh, I'm a good writer, I like to write. And they're like, I see so many people on Reddit and Twitter being like, oh, I love writing, but I'm really bad at like talking to other people, or I would they say networking, but whatever the fuck that means, or like getting out there, talking about myself, talking story, doing that. I'm like, it's going to be rough for you then, in terms of making. It's not saying you couldn't make it, but that is a big part of a skill set of being a professional. And I mean, what I mean to say is at the top level. I'm saying working with major studios and major actors and major directors and major producers, because the people who are at the top of those games, there's a reason why those people tend to move into producing or directing, like J.J. Abrams or like Keith Goldsman or like Simon Kinberg, because when you're that good, you have taken on aspects of producing, you've taken on directing, you've taken on aspects of these things, because that's inherently where it's moving towards essentially. So yeah, it's all part and parcel.
Yeah, there are a lot of skills that go into it. Now, let's roll it back a little bit. I have a ton of questions on all fronts, and we'll hopefully get to all of them. If it's not the Nicholl, if it's not Coverfly, how do you and you continue to take on writers that are new to you, and you guys are
Mhm.
very much in the business of breaking in emerging writers. How do
Mhm.
you find clients? Because I think that today that's what writers are looking at when they think about Coverfly or the Nicholl.
Sure,
Those seem
of
like
course.
pipelines for
Well, there's an
discovery that have gone
avenue
away.
there that's closed down. Yeah, I mean, look, my number, people, no one ever believes me when I say this, but it's true. And there's a movie gotten made via this. Is like Queries. I found one of the number one scripts in the blacklist via query. I still read my queries. Most of them are terrible, but that's the luck of the draw. It's like scratching a lotto ticket, right? Most of them are going to be blanks. But I read them all. If they have an attachment to them, I delete them because that opens and exposes me. And if the person listening to this got an attachment from someone they didn't know, I'm guessing they're not going to open it unless they kind of want to, open themselves up to, malicious possibilities, especially when you're in more of a public facing job like I am. But yeah, I read all, if there's just a log line and a query and no attachments, I definitely read it. People are like, well, you never responded. It's like, because I didn't want to read it. Didn't seem that interesting. I only have so much time in my life. It's not my job to read everyone's screenplays. It's just my job to read the ones that sound interesting to me based on a log line. If you're like, well, I don't know how to write a log line or well, then it's gonna be a hard ride for you as a screenwriter because one of the first things you get in a room with people are gonna be like, you'll be like, okay, so tell us what the movie that you want to write an adaptation of Robotech? Okay, what's your vision for it? Like it's that kind of job. If you can't present your material in a intriguing, appealing way, that's going to be a problem. And that's an element, by the way, of being a screenwriter is figuring out how to take material, like they talk about, like, I think it was Save the Cat that talked about the Pope in the pool trick, right? Which he's
Hmm.
got all this exposition, but in the background, the Pope is swimming in a pool, so that makes the exposition easier. If you can't figure out smart ways to get across shoe leather kind of stuff, that's a problem and a larger problem, I would say. So queries would be the number one. There are still some contests out there that, like I am a reader for the Austin Film Festival. I work a lot with Script Pipeline, who I think are excellent. Roadmap will send me clients or
I
not,
think you also
next
read for
clients.
Final Draft, right? For the big break competition.
Yeah, I don't think that exists anymore.
Oh,
I
that's
don't think it
there.
exists. Oh, it's
That's
still like
still there.
this?
Yeah.
Yeah, then I guess I haven't heard from them in a minute, so I don't know, honestly. I just assumed anything to do with industry arts is like, who the heck knows? Yeah, that stuff. I still read for that. And then you're kind of, they tell you who the winners are, and you're like, okay, you kind of look through it and you're like, does any of this look interesting to me? I was supposed to go to USC first pitch tomorrow or tonight actually, but I can't do that. Due to an obligation, but like I'll read the book of people. One of my kind of new exciting clients was someone that my colleague Zach found out of in fact, we found two people out of AFI recently, in consecutive years. They didn't necessarily know each other, but like one person in 2023 and one person in 2024. Obviously those are high level film schools, but I also read like NYU's The Purple List, which is kind of their list of like, 5 to 8 good scripts or whatever. And again, I don't read all the scripts. I just look for the log lines to see what's intriguing to me. So there's that. There's obviously referrals. If a client or an executive I know says, "Hey, you should check this out," then like I'm going to do that. And then probably the one that I also use the most, that along with queries, is the Blacklist website. I get an email every week from them that says, "Hey, our readers like these pilots. Hey, our readers like these feature scripts." And so I always skim them to see if anything's interesting. I would say this is gonna be depressing for every people who want to break into TV. We're not really reading a lot of TV pilots right now because trying to break in up and coming writers is near to impossible,
Yeah.
with the staffing, you know, narrowing, with so few. I would say like 40% less shows are being made or something like that. And when they are made, it's like only 6 people on staff or so because of the minimum. And as a result, it's like if they're going to hire a staff writer, it's going to be typically, not always, but typically one of two things. Either someone the showrunner already knows because they were their writer's assistant or like script coordinator or personal assistant, or somehow there's some kind of relationship going back there. Or it's going to be someone like I had a client who I won't say exactly what their job was, but it was a very, very, it wasn't this, but I'm going to give you an example. They basically were making a show about like Navy SEALs, and this person wasn't a Navy SEAL who also happened to be a screenwriter, who had been on the blacklist. It wasn't a Navy SEAL thing, but the job is as rare as that, essentially, maybe
Hmm.
more rare. And so they end up getting hired because they brought a level of personal knowledge to the job that impossible for anyone else to have. But beyond that, it's really, really hard to get people staffed at the moment. And so it's hard for us to take anyone on and be like, we're going to help you get staffed when, I had a signing meeting with a client. I have a client and she was on the blacklist. She staffed in multiple rooms, and then her agent went off to become a manager, so she wasn't repped anymore. And I went around town to try and get her new agent. Nobody wanted to sign her. Nobody. Zero. Even places that were a little bit lower down the totem pole, let's say. Anyways, through her work and my work, she ended up getting staffed on an Amazon show, a very high prominent Amazon show. Suddenly, every single agency wanted to sign her. And so she ended up getting staffing. And when I was in that signing meeting, they said, this is the first signing meeting we've been in like 6 to 9 months.
Wow.
So, I mean, think otherwise, I think in terms of like someone who's like more junior in their career, if she's like story editor, executive story editor level, um, but um, but like, I'm sure they're still trying to like poach Shonda Rhimes or whatever the heck,
Of
like
course.
I don't really mean that because I think she's at this agency, but like my point being like I'm sure but like in terms of like up and coming people, 6 to 9 months, because like to them their whole point is generally the way agents are thinking, especially TV agents, is I already have 150, 200 clients. I can't get work for at least half of them, if not more. They're begging me for work. Why am I taking on someone new when I can't get work for the people I've already made promises to? You know, which I find a little frustrating because I'm like, these things are not, you can find someone, they could be the slam dunk. Like I had that experience recently where someone turned into the slam dunk and now everybody wants to sign them, but they didn't want to sign her like 6 months ago, or a year ago or whatever, and so that's frustrating, but I believe in the people I believe in. And so if anything, I think it's understandable on agent's point. It kind of maybe slightly admirable that they're like, I have obligations to the people I'm already working with. I don't want to add someone else on and make false promises that I can't deliver on, essentially, in terms of staffing and
Hmm.
things like that. But yeah, it's a really, really rough TV landscape out there. And I think for myself and my colleagues, we're focused on the people we have, most of whom have already staffed before, trying to get those people staffed. And that's a hard enough job that taking on someone who is the term would be a baby writer, whether you
Hmm.
like that or not, who has never staffed before in television. That just feels, unless they're like working someone's assistant directly, it feels like there's a clear path forward. That's going to be really, really hard to do, And I know people are going to be really disappointed to hear that. I mean, if you didn't already kind of figure that one out, because I think it's pretty open out there, but
Yeah.
it's a rough landscape out there. But to go back to my original point is we get these emails, top pilots. I don't really look at the pilot. I'll skim through the pilots, honestly looking to see like, here, and these are these any pilots sound so amazing, I got to read them. And B, could I maybe turn these pilots into a feature, essentially, But I read those emails very closely from the blacklist where it's like our readers recommend, and then it's like 6 features. And I mean, I have to imagine pilot stat is very down. Pilot submissions are down because there are weeks that go by, there's like one or zero, on that list essentially. Um, they seem to be ramping up a little more now, but I read those very closely. And if a logline sounds intriguing to me, I will click on it, I will download it, I will read it when I have a moment. And then if I like it, I'll reach out to the person. And that happened pretty recently, actually. I signed someone off of a blacklist of the blacklist website. And so we're working on kind of doing some work on the third act of his script, which I'm really intrigued by. So yeah, it's happened within the last, I want to say 2 months, I think.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, what makes you excited about a script that makes you decide? I mean, we talk about starts with a log line that has to grab you, then it's on
Mhm.
the page. What makes you decide that you want to meet with a writer, and what makes you want to sign the writer once you've met them?
It's hard to quantify like what makes me love a script other than like I can't put it down. I got to keep reading it. It's kind of like why do you like this song? You're like, well, the key changed to A to like, it's like, it's someone asked me once if I could write down on a single like one or two sheets of paper why what scripts were good or why I liked what script, and I'm like, I can't. You just, like I read this script that I signed the client off of the blacklist, right? And I'm like, I was like, wow, this is really keeping going. Oh, wow, that's a surprise. Oh, wow, I didn't see that coming. Oh, this is intriguing. The writing is grabbing me. Things are moving. It's clicking with something in my brain, essentially. Um, that's it. I wish I had a better I would be like, here it is, the scientific process of it. It's just it sounds interesting, and then it delivers on that promise, essentially, you know? And I feel on some level that um I think if I think it's interesting, other people think it's interesting. I remember like, our mutual friend Alad Ziv wrote the script Court 17, and I remember after I read it, I was in the shower and I kept thinking about it. Because it's about this tennis player and she ends up in a time loop she is kind of coming to the end of her career, and she's playing the 19-year-old best player in the world, essentially. And keeps getting worked every time. And it kind of reminded me of playing video games and like playing it over and over and over and over. And this kind of idea you have in your head sometimes, not a video game thing quite, but like that if I played the best person in the world 3 million times, I could eventually figure it out because I would figure out their tells enough. And so it really stuck in my mind. It felt sticky and interesting. It kept me thinking about it even after I'd read it. And so I was like, if I'm feeling this way, I have to imagine other people will feel that way. And you have to go by that. And anytime I've been like, well, I don't love this, but I think other people will, that's been a mistake, you know? And honestly, I don't know the word for, but like an injustice. That's injustice is the wrong word, but like it hasn't been a favor to the writer because I can't represent them properly if I don't love it with my whole heart, you know? So yeah, that's that. In terms of what makes me want to sign them, it's interesting. It's like if I'm reading the script and it's just a fucking slam dunk, like it is amazing, so great, A plus, then I'm probably gonna overlook if they're a little bit weird or something like that, you
I
know?
mean, I've met many writers that you worked with over the years, and it's the whole spectrum of personalities.
Correct. 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 And like you're always thinking is like if this person gets in a room with my friend who's an executive at Sony, what are they going to think of this person? Do they want to work with this person? It's like there's a client that we signed recently, and this person is a slam dunk. Like they're a phenomenal writer, they're really driven, and they get in a room with people, and people naturally like them. What I want is someone to call me up after reading the writer and be like, "Oh my God, they're amazing. I have to find a project with them." Because it's so hard out there. So that's the dream per se. I'm also judging like not just how weird they are, but are they willing to take notes? If I'm like, hey, I think we need to change the third act, and they're like, no, it's perfect or whatever, then I'm like, oh, this probably isn't going to work because they're not interested in taking notes. How driven do they seem to be? Do they really want a career, or is this just a hobby for them? What are their goals? Are their goals realistic? Do they want to direct every single thing they write? And if so, have they done a short film? Have they put the time into wanting to be a director? How realistic are they, in what they want to do? I would say there's a lot of conversation out there about how many scripts do you have to write for a manager to be interested. Personally, if I read one and I like it, I'm good. Like with a lot, I only read the one and I didn't need to read anything else. It's like, do you want to read other ones? I'm like, not really. I know what I like. But there are other managers out there who are like, well, I need to read a second one. In my opinion, you only need to read a second one if you're really on the fence. I haven't personally ever felt that way. I'm either yes or no based on one, but I think there are other people who are maybe I don't know, they have a different process. They're not as silly as I am, where they're like, it's good, but they're like, no, I must feel this out logically. I'm more like if I love it, I love it. If I don't, I don't. Um, so that's kind of where I'm at personally. Yeah, it's so all these kind of things. You're just meeting the person, being like, it's kind of like a date in a certain way. Like we have a client who has agency signing meetings on Thursday and Friday. I was explaining to her kind of like and I'm like, it's kind of like a platonic date. It's like a work date, right? You're like, do I like this person? Do they like me? Do I feel like we have a similar vision? I always tell people this is more of a manager thing than an agent thing is do you feel comfortable asking quote unquote stupid questions? Like, hey, what's an option? Or how does this credit bonus work? Or what are territories? I want you to feel comfortable to ask me those questions because if you don't, you'll probably just be like, uh-huh, but you don't know what you're actually agreeing to per se. So particularly with your manager, I think you want someone you're comfortable asking questions to. Agents a little bit less so. They're going to be in your life a fair amount less typically. Um, but yeah, that's kind of it. I'm looking, do we click? Do we feel like we're on the same page? Do we have the same vision for their career. Like if I read someone and they've written a really great action movie, I'm read them like, oh, so like, what are you kind of thinking? What do you want to write next? Like, I want to write a comedy. I'm like, okay, it's quite different from what I read, you know. Um, how do they want to build, God help me, but their brand, so that when someone says, like, I know when someone says, oh, it's an Elise Hollander script, my wife, who's one of my clients, is a writer, I think people have got to deal with what that means. It means poppy, it means kind of sexy, well-written, commercial, it means like a movie, like it reads like a movie, I think. Because she's been very thoughtful and worked really hard at kind of creating that vibe. Whereas, and then, like I have another client, Kevin Sheridan, and he writes really grounded, character-driven, typically based on true story, drama thriller projects, different from mostly what my wife writes, and so like he's a different brand, but it's still they're both great brands, and they've been based on quality and hard work and diligence and thoughtfulness. And so you're looking at someone and being like, okay, does this person have, a question I often ask people in the room, and sometimes it kind of throws them, is, can you tell me a movie in the last 5, 10 years that you feel like you could have written, and not that you like, but you're like, yeah, I could have written that movie.
Yeah.
Like if you write action, you'd be like, I could have written Sicario, or I could have written, this movie, Top Gun, or this or that. It gives me an idea of where to put you. And also when people are like, yeah, no, there's nothing in the last 5, 10 years that, that I would have written. I'm like, well, maybe you're not right for this marketplace. They're like, oh, well, I would have written Goonies. And I'm like, well, cool, they don't make Goonies anymore,
Yeah. It's been a while.
Yeah, and so like, and what also tells me like, do they have a head for this business? Again, are they kind of doing the hobbyist thing where like I just write for fun, and like that's cool, but like I make my living when you make money, and so do I want to put all the kind of free work in to try and steer you towards making money if you don't really want to make any money? I know that for some people they're like, oh, it's about the art, it's about the love. That's cool, but like this is a business, and
Mhm.
it's certainly a business for me, and I don't put a roof over my daughter's head and food on the plate through like people's love. I do it because people buy my client scripts or pay them because they think that there's a path to making money through the material that they're generating, that's the truth of it, really.
Which is an important truth. I mean, at the end of the day, this is a business. And if if you have the one movie that you're trying to make because you love it and it means the world to you and you can do it low budget, like go raise some money from friends and
Yeah.
family. You're not trying to be a professional writer. It's a different scenario. You can do that plus other things.
I think there are people who are hobbyists and they
Yeah.
like to play at cosplay, being screenwriter, and they'll talk on social media or otherwise about like, oh, this is bad for us or whatever. And it's like, not a professional screenwriter. You're just pretending to be one,
Yeah.
because you're standing next to people on Twitter, and I'm not like mad about that or anything like that, but it is kind of one of those things where, if you're a pro, you think like a pro, you act like a pro, because these things are important and you're kind of judged on them. And by the way, if you're not, then there's a million other people out there. I
Yeah.
think you have to take like when I work with my client Ian Shore, who's kind of like my day one, it's like when we work on something, we're like, is this going to get made? Is this something that we can sell? And Ian might be like, yeah, this is going to sell, but it's just not something I love. And that's totally fair and reasonable. Right now, I have another Bellevue client writing an old idea that I brought to Ian that Ian is like, look, it's good. I just don't think I'm the right guy for it. And again, if you don't love the idea, you're probably not going to do the best job at it. But then we found another idea that we do think is more commercial, and that well, not more commercial, that is commercial, and Ian is excited about writing. But we're always thinking about those things, and that's why he's gotten so many movies made, and that's why he lives in Hawaii in a nice house.
Should we all be so lucky?
Yes.
What are some other mistakes you talked about, like not being collaborative or open to notes? What are some mistakes or what are some things that a writer can do to really kind of get in their own way as they're trying to build a career?
I mean, definitely not being willing to take notes is one. Being very like, sometimes like there are times when people are just like, no, you don't get it. This is a metaphor. This is that. And I'm like, or they're like, you didn't read closely enough. And I'm like, well, that's not my problem. That's your problem. And I have people like, well, this sentence here tipped it off. And I'm like, you have to understand that most executives they don't understand. Most executives are reading 12 to 20 scripts every fucking week. And so if it's not like clear, that's your problem. Nah. No one goes to see a movie and they're like, yeah, I didn't get the ending. They're like, well, you didn't pay close enough attention to minute 59 when in the background there was this thing that happened. And you're like, okay, like it doesn't work that way. And so I think that's one of the things is you have to understand that we're in the business of moving things forward. And it's not, again, I guess it goes back to like, are you a professional or are you a hobbyist, essentially? And if you're a professional, you're being like, okay, how do I get my scripts, market ready? That's like a phrase that people throw around a lot on Twitter or what, like, I'm ready or like the script's market ready, and okay, determined by who? Like, I would never say that. I would never say my scripts are well, market ready. I mean, I guess I'm a determination of that because I actually put things in the marketplace. But like, but if they said they don't sell, then I guess I was wrong. But it's like, are they? I never say this script is production ready. Like that's a crazy thing to say. All you can do at the end of the day is be like, do I believe in it? And so I think you have to kind of act in a certain in a professional way and put your all into something, but also understand there's a larger industry out there. And I think that's the case. If I had to be honest with you, it's like people not treating it like a job. It's a job. And if you don't treat it like a job, it'll never be one. No one falls into a career of scripting in the sense of like, I can see someone writing one script and it turns into a great movie and cool, but then you don't sustain it unless you're taking it seriously as a business, essentially, you know? And yeah, I think that's kind of the probably the biggest I think it's a little bit fueled by the Reddits, the Twitters, I don't know, other Discords, whatever they're TikTok videos, whatever, where it's like, to be completely honest, it's people who haven't made any money or very little money talking to other people and being like, well, this is how to do it per se or whatever. And it's not to say that you have to have made a ton of money to be someone who advises people on it necessarily. I don't believe that at all. I don't necessarily believe that a very successful screenwriter is a good teacher, and I don't believe that an unsuccessful screenwriter isn't a good teacher. But I think more it's about an attitude of approaching the industry from a place of how do I get things done? Within the space of also doing the things that I care about. Because if you don't care about it, you're never going to do a good job at it. But I think you have to find that middle ground of something you love, but also something that the industry is looking to do, as opposed to being like, nobody wants to make Westerns anymore, but I'm going to drag them into making a Western. If you're writing a Western, just guess that nobody else wants, most people don't want to read it or buy it or make it. And maybe there's a few people out there who do, but I don't, if a client kind of said, I'm running a Western, I'd be like, well, that's gonna be really tough. But like, I'm never gonna tell them don't do it. But I'm like, when you take it out, there's probably only 20 to 30 places I can take it to. And if those 20, 30 places don't want to do it, we're kind of shit out of luck. Whereas if you write a horror film, there's like 80 to 100 places I can take it to. And I don't view it as my job to tell people what to write, but I do view it as my job to tell people the odds, essentially.
Mhm.
Like, hey, let's rewrite this script, make the third act in a different way because I think that's a much better shot at selling. If you're like, no, I don't want that because this, that, or the other, maybe I'll still take it out, maybe I won't. But if I did take it out, my expectations of success are much lower because it's not in the place where I think it personally needs to be. And again, like people are like, well, John, you don't know everything, and that's absolutely true that I don't know everything. But if I'm taking out material, I have to feel like I know what I'm talking about or know what I'm doing. It's my position, out there. And so I have to feel confident and believe in the material and the writer because the material is essentially serving, if it does a really good job, it's serving up the writer for a longer career.
Absolutely. Um, Now, last question. You've given us a ton, and I know you have to run. So, last question. You've given a lot of advice here and over the years after or during COVID, you had released a PDF of a lot of advice to writers. We're
Mhm.
now a few years later. What advice do you have to writers who do want a writing career, who would love to one day write that query that you pay attention
Sure.
to write that script that makes you bite? What advice do you have for them for becoming a better writer, for becoming somebody who is reasonably planning for a career in terms of their professional knowledge? What advice do you have?
I mean, I think it's kind of the same advice I would always give, even though it's maybe even harder right now than it was in years past. Although, these things are somewhat cyclical and 3 or 4 years from now, I don't know, we'll be back to a boom, but I have to imagine things will be better. At least I hope they will. Um, but guess what I would say is like the ways to get better as a writer are to read as much as you can. And I don't just mean screenplays, read books, read plays, read the newspaper, look for ideas in interesting places beyond your people are always like, oh, I write what I know. Oh, well, I used to take the bus every day. So this is a script about taking the bus. And it's like, yeah, what right would you know means speak to your emotional experience, not necessarily to your literal experience. As I think was in like this older movie about Hollywood. I remember Dennis Hopper saying, I forget the name of the movie, but he goes, just because it happened to you doesn't mean it's interesting, you know? And so anyhow, that's the number one thing is read as much as you can, write as much as you can, watch as much as you can. But in terms of an attitude, I think one thing that is again, I think a little bit mistaken and comes on social media is like, I wrote 15 pages today, I wrote 10 pages, I wrote 4 scripts in 1 year. Well, it doesn't really matter how much you wrote in one day or how many scripts you wrote in a year if they're like not great. I would rather have a client one amazing script every year or 18 months than 4 mediocre ones. And where that really starts from is concept and thinking, like there's a script I took out recently and it went amazing. But prior to that, we had really struggled on figure out the next thing to write. And it took months to figure out the right thing for the client to write. And once she finally landed on the thing she really connected with, amazing script and it's had an amazing result. But we worked really, really hard. And that's often all sign clients. And we'll start going over new ideas. And I never try to be insulting in any way, but I am saying, hey, I don't think there's anything here that I can sell. And again, I'm not the boss of anybody, but it
Mhm.
is my place to kind of be like, hey, I'm gonna tell you what I think the market will bear. Or also, like, I've read 5 others. Oh, it's a script about, zombies taking over a house. I've read 5 of those. Do you know what I'm saying? It doesn't feel novel to me. And so I think people really have to be, the word I would use is ruthless. They have to be ruthless on their ideas because the marketplace is going to be far more ruthless. Here's what happens. You spend a year writing a screenplay. I send it to somebody and they come back and they go, yeah, it wasn't for me. Thanks anyways. That's it. That is the response. It is at that they will never read it again. It is dead. It is done. Okay. And so you've got to put into it as hard as you can. You got to really stress test the idea before you write a single page. Really work really, really hard on the idea because it doesn't matter how many miles you log on something. It matters what the destination is. And if you've written, I kind of compare the two things. If you write something, let's say you wrote a mediocre script because you're a mediocre writer, but it's a great concept. It's kind of like having a rundown house in the middle of like really nice neighborhood. Someone's going to buy it for a lot of money and then rebuild it because like the location is amazing. That's like having a great concept. Whereas if you write a beautiful script, but it's the least commercial idea of all time, it's like having a gorgeous house in the middle of nowhere. Nobody wants to live there, you know? And so you have to be really, really ruthless on these ideas before you write them. So many people they want to rush into writing the script. They think that writing a script is typing as many pages as possible. No, it's figuring out what you're going to write. Because if what you're writing isn't exciting or interesting or intriguing or different or novel, if it's just the same, it doesn't matter how many pages you banged out in a single day. Because I'm gonna take it out and people are like, yeah, I feel like I've seen it before. Sorry. Doesn't matter, you know? And so I think that's the thing that differentiates the professionals from the amateurs, honestly, is the professionals are really, 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 really hard on their ideas. Really hard on their ideas. And then when the idea doesn't work, they pick it up and they say, what do I learn from this? I'm gonna try again.
Yep.
So a lot of people I see on social media, they're trying to sell the same fucking script for 5 years over and over and over. And clearly the marketplace has told you nobody wants this script. And I understand it on some level. You're like, I believe in it. It's gonna find it, just one more reader. And that's fine, but you could have put that time into writing another screenplay and then seeing what happens. Um, and just I'll put it like this. When I've taken a screenplay as wide as I can, it doesn't mean that I won't occasionally give it to people like they're like, we're looking for a zombie movie. I'm like, well, here's this great zombie script. It never found a home, but I really love it. And sometimes, once in a while, something comes of that. But usually I moved on to new business,
Yeah.
because you've taken it to 60, 80 places and nobody buys it. That's something that it's certainly at the least in that moment in time, the marketplace is telling you something. you
For
know,
sure.
and you have to learn from it and you have to move on. And I think that is the thing I would say is like really learn from the stuff and be really hard. Same way that if you go and see a movie, you aren't like, well, it was a movie. I'm happy with that. You're like, nah, it was boring, or nah, there's no conflict in it, or the ending sucked. No one's ever like, well, it was a movie, it's good enough for me. They're
Yeah.
like, they're very hard. The same way that I bet the people listening to this podcast can very often be very hard on the movies and the TV shows that they watch. You need to be just as hard, if not harder, on the material you yourself are writing and saying, hey, is this interesting to anyone else? It has to be interesting to you first. But even then, like, have I really pushed myself? Is this the most interesting version of this story? The question I ask my clients every single time is, what's the most either interesting kind of character or setup we can get into? What's the most kind of interesting setup or like concept or world? And then within that, who's the most interesting character to be in that situation? You know? And we're like, it's not just good enough to just be somewhat generic. You have to push and push and push. So if you don't do that work up front, it doesn't matter how beautiful the writing on page 95 is. No one's going to get to page 95 because at page 15 or 20, they're going to be like, I feel like I've seen this before.
That is all incredibly useful, and I really love the note about how much criticism we can have about the movies that we watch and the TV shows that we watch, and that we need to apply that critical eye to concepts as well. I think that's really brilliant. John, thank you for taking the time for allowing me to open this new series with you. You've given me so much great information. I really, really appreciate it. And I know that people will watch this and be interested. For those of you who are watching, Final Draft Big Break is open right now and taking submissions. So that was actually under cast and crew as opposed to industry arts.
Fair,
But they're
fair.
all side by side with one another. So I certainly understand the
I'm
confusion.
glad it's still around. I pay attention to it. I think I haven't been asked to judge for a minute, so maybe that's on me.
I think they're just like lining everything up. So I'm sure you'll be hearing from them. But thank you again for doing this. I always delight in watching all the things that you do and listening to all the things that you have to say. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, I'm gonna stop the recording.